All right, I'm going to start chapter 10 today. So chapter 10 is all about statistics. Statistics are really important for everyday life because statistics are used in all different fields of study. They're used in business and sports and politics. They're used in pretty much any kind of field you could possibly think of. You're going to have to deal with statistics. And they really help us understand large amounts of information. So in the first lesson, they talk about statistical measures in lesson 10.1. And it talks about how when we try to get statistics, we have to first of all determine, are we going to ask everyone or are we just going to ask a few people? So let's say, for example, I want to find out how many people in the United States like Coke versus how many people like Pepsi. Now, if I were to ask every single person in the United States whether they like Coke or Pepsi, we would call that a population. So a population, what that means is I'm asking everyone. Now the population could be the population of the United States, it could be the population of a school, it could be the population of a family, it could be the population of a bunch of rabbits, but it's whatever I'm talking about, it's everything in that category. That's called a population. If I get information about everyone in that category, we call that a parameter. Now, obviously, most of the time that's really hard to ask everyone in a certain category, especially if you have a really big category. So normally when we get something, instead of asking everyone, we ask a sample. So a sample means I have not asked everyone in that category. So if the category is Heritage Baptist Academy, instead of asking every student at Heritage Baptist Academy, I ask a couple in each grade. That would be a sample. A population means I ask everyone at Heritage Baptist Academy. Or if we're talking about girls, instead of asking every girl in the entire world, I ask a couple thousand girls from different countries and different ages. That's a sample. When I just get my information from a sample, we call that a statistic. So if I ask everyone in that category, we call that category a population if it's everyone in that category, and the information I get is a parameter. If it's just a small group of the whole population, we call that a sample, and the information I get is a statistic. So normally we don't do parameters because normally it takes way too long and too much effort to ask everyone, so we just try to get a sample. Now the problem with statistics is because they're not based on everyone, we have to be careful about who we actually ask. So for example, if I want to figure out what do students at Heritage Baptist Academy enjoy doing? If I only ask people from kindergarten and first grade, if that's where I take my sample from, it's not going to be a very good statistic. It's not going to be a good representation of the whole school. I have to make sure my statistics reflect every type of person in the school. This is a lot of times what happens in politics. If someone gets a statistic about, let's say, for example, who wants to vote for this new law, but they only get it from Mississippi and South Carolina, well, people in Arkansas or people in New York or people in California or Oregon or Minnesota might have a very different idea, so that wouldn't be a good sample. So my samples need to make sure that they are a good representation of the whole population and not just a segment of the population. Also, I have to be careful when I get my information, my statistics, when I pass that out, that I do it I have to be careful how I collect my information. So for example, if I'm only collecting my information over the internet, maybe people that don't have the internet or don't like to use the internet might not be represented. If I only get my information by mail, well then a lot of people who don't check their mail or who don't really pay attention to the mail might not be represented. So I have to pay close attention to that. Also, I have to make sure my sample is big enough. So if I want a sample of, again, Heritage Baptist Academy, I don't want to just ask 2 students, because what those 2 students might like to do might not be representative of the whole school. If I want a sample of California, I'm not just going to ask 50 Californians. That's not a big enough sample to be able to get an understanding of what all of California probably wants. So I have to make sure it is big enough. Next, I have 4 different ways that I can collect that information. So when I'm collecting the information, I can collect it in 4 different ways. One way I can collect it is just random. So random means that I have no way of, no specific way that I'm collecting it. For example, I just put all of the names of the people from the school in a hat and I pull out those names. Or I open up a phone book and I just randomly point to a name. Or I just start calling numbers randomly. That would be a random way of choosing them. Another way I can get information is by using a systematic method. So a systematic method would be I do the same thing every time. For example, I choose every 10th person, or I choose every person whose name begins with A, or something like that. I have a system to how I do it. It's not random. There is a specific way that I do it every single time. That's systematic. Another way I can do it is called convenience. Convenience means the thing that makes it the easiest. So for example, I might just ask the people that walk by on the sidewalk on a certain day. Or I might ask all the people that ate at this bakery on a certain day. That would be convenience. Finally, we have cluster. So cluster is, again, let's say I'm taking the whole state of California. So what I do is I take a few from Antioch, I take a few from Eureka, and a few from Los Angeles. And I just take from one area. That's a cluster. If I was talking about a school, I might ask a few from 2nd grade and a few from 8th grade. So that's a cluster, a certain class in the school. If I'm talking about a city, I might do this neighborhood and this neighborhood. That's a cluster, a group of people in a certain area. So when I am doing what we call statistics, statistical measurements, first of all, we need to understand how many people am I asking? Am I asking everyone, a population? Well, then I'll get a parameter. Am I asking just a certain group of people? That's a sample, so I get a statistic. How am I going to ask them? Am I just going to randomly pull out names? Well, then that's random. Am I going to use a method that I do the same thing every time, always ask the 15th person every time? That is systematic. If I always do the same thing over and over again, it's a system. Convenience. Am I going to do it on a certain day or just the people that walk by me? That's convenience. Finally, cluster is if I take a certain class or a certain area of the country, certain area of, let's say I'm in a ballpark and I want to find out something about the fans in the ballpark, then I just choose certain sections of seats. That will be a cluster. That is how I do that. So that's the first part of lesson 10.1. I'll come back with another video and talk about the second part, which is what we call the 4 measures of central tendency.